Good morning everyone, welcome to Berwick Baptist Church Online. Today is Sunday the 21st of June. At the moment we're alternating our Sunday preaching between the Old Testament book of Exodus and alternatively looking at the 10 holy habits found in Acts chapter 2. My name is Dave Ward. Today I'm giving an introduction to the series on holy habits. I've called it Welcome to the Family because we're going to go right back to the very beginnings of the church, the very first disciples that Jesus ever called. So in the beginning, how did the church look? Well, the first thing is really important to understand that Jesus didn't recruit people into an organisation. He invited them to join his community, to join his family. It was a community with Jesus at the centre. They travelled, ate, prayed, learned, served, healed, watched, helped, taught, laughed, and suffered together. And together they were changed and transformed to be more like Jesus. So the whole idea behind the church is not to do with buildings and events and services. It's to do with a group of people coming together around Jesus and slowly but surely being changed to resemble him in all sorts of ways. So Jesus took that first bunch of disciples and he helped them to become a disciple-making community. Right from the very beginning, he made sure that they looked in two different directions. First of all, they looked outward in service. All the healings and the various other things that Jesus did out there in the community, not done to people who were already in the community, but done out there with people who had yet to discover what it was to belong to Jesus' community. And then the second, inward, to build deep relationships within the group of those who were his followers, those who believed in him. In fact, if you think about it, it's all about relationships. If you're a Christian, it's about your renewed relationships with God. It's about the way that you can renew your relationship with the world at large and with one another. There are three vital ingredients of a disciple-making community, the kind of church that Jesus planted right at the beginning. First of all, he took people with him. They were on mission together, sharing and serving. Secondly, on a lot of occasions, they worshipped together. They prayed together. They learned together. And finally, and this is the hard bit in some ways, they chose to belong to the community, whatever happened. Being on mission together, sharing and serving, worshipping together, praying and learning, choosing to belong to the community, whatever happens. So, that's how Jesus started things off, discipling a small group of people so that they in turn could disciple others. So what happened next? Just before he left planet Earth and went back to heaven, Jesus in Matthew 28:18-20 came to his disciples. Jesus came and told his disciples, it says, "I've been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I've given you. And be sure of this, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." So right there, Jesus said to his disciples, just before he went back to heaven, your job now is to carry on doing what I've been doing. Your job now is to make disciples. How? Teach these new disciples, Jesus said, to obey all the commands that I have given you. In other words, go on doing what I did with you. Meet with them. Take them along with you. Show them how to do things. Encourage them to do them for themselves. Give them what they need to make them independent followers of Jesus, whose lives are centered on him. So, what did they do? Well, first of all, they gathered together as Jesus had told them, and they waited and they prayed that God would send the Holy Spirit. Because without the Holy Spirit, we can't really do anything. It's all us and none of God. So they waited there until the Holy Spirit came. And on the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came, the 120 people that were gathered together, on whom the Holy Spirit fell, were pushed out onto the streets, celebrating together, worshipping God, and taking opportunities to explain what was going on and to point people once again to Jesus at the centre. And what was the result? Well, there was an explosion of new life. 3,000 new Christians were added to the church that day. Can you imagine what that must have been like? And so these new Christians, they're like babies. They're welcome to the family. How on earth are those early disciples of Jesus going to help them to grow up to become more like him? Well, Jesus had said, go on doing what I did with you. In Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47, we read about some of the things that early church did together. Acts chapter 2, verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favour of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So clearly they had something right, this new community of God's people, because as they went on doing the things that Jesus had done with them together, every day new people were being added to the church. What an amazing experience that must have been. And as they took those new believers, they in turn helped them to grow in faith and to be more like Jesus. How did they do that? Well, they introduced them to 10 holy habits. They're there in that passage that we've just read, and we'll look at them in a bit more detail in a moment. But the important thing about these holy habits is that they weren't there to make them a sort of holy club who could gather together and escape from the reality of the world. The truth is, those holy habits were given to them so that they could live for Jesus and be like Jesus in the real world. It helped them to live day by day in the real world. And because people saw them in the real world living in a way that was quite mind-blowing and so different to anything they'd seen before, a community of really different people who had somehow come together and who loved one another and who were there for one another and who, well, just resembled Jesus. Every day, people were added to their number. You know, in every generation, when God is at work, we see a renewed commitment to the holy habits in Jesus' community. Down through history, there have been times when these important 10 things have kind of waned in the way that the church goes after them. They stop being devoted. Maybe they forget some of these really important things. Maybe they get out of balance and focus on some and not on others. Down through history, they're lost and then recovered. I guess maybe some of you who've been a Christian for a long time wonder why it's worth doing a series based on those very, very basic disciple-y things that many of you will have been living for a very long time. I've been a Christian for well over 50 years. And I can tell you this, early on, I learned many of these habits. As the years have gone on, sometimes I've forgotten some of them. Sometimes I haven't practiced some of them. And so my resemblance of Jesus has got a bit out of kilter, a bit out of sync. Perhaps I'll say a bit more about that later on. But we need in every generation, because our memories are short, we need in every generation to rediscover God's holy habits for growing to be more like Jesus as a community together. Maybe some of you are a bit fazed by the fact that I'm using the word habit. And so I thought, well, maybe we'd just have a little think about that for a while. What's a habit? Loads of definitions, but one I've particularly settled on is this one. A habit is a settled or regular tendency or practice, especially one that's hard to give up. So a habit is something that when we get into a certain kind of situation, it's triggered. It's almost automatic. A habit is settled, a habit is regular, and a habit is something that we practice, or something maybe that takes practice. Habits can be good or bad. But the important thing is that a habit, a good habit particularly, eventually becomes a thing that we do without even thinking about it. The important thing too is this, that it changes us. It changes us for good or ill, I guess. Here's a quote from someone: a habit is something you can do without thinking, which is why most of us have so many of them. You can probably all point to your bad habits, because somehow it's easier to bring those to mind. But all of us, as believers in Jesus, have developed some really good habits as well, I hope, that when we get into certain situations, they come to the fore, whether we think about it or not. So we're going to look at 10 habits. That's how I read Acts chapter 2. Some people add other things and they talk about Christian disciplines, but I just want to concentrate on what another writer has called 10 holy habits, and we get this lovely simple framework in Acts chapter 2. So here are the 10. Perhaps I've changed, or the person that originally wrote the stuff that goes with these, I've changed some of the names a bit to kind of make them more understandable, perhaps, as I've lifted them from Acts chapter 2. So here are the 10. Biblical teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, prayer, sharing resources, serving, eating together, gladness and generosity, worship, and finally, making more disciples. And what's going to happen over the next few weeks, on the alternative week, usually to the week when we're speaking about the book of Exodus, one of us is going to talk about one of these holy habits. As it happens, next week, I'm going to carry on. I'm going to talk about prayer, a really fundamental basic habit. But over the next weeks, that's what we hope to do, to talk about these 10 holy habits. But we hope very much that it won't just be a matter of words, but that what we say will encourage you and challenge you and spur you on to consider the ways that you're trying to develop and grow your relationship with Jesus, and how maybe some emphasis on one or more of these habits has slipped. Now, it is really important as we practice these 10 holy habits that we keep things in balance. Some Christians, they get really into the biblical teaching. And the danger there is that we basically become Christians with big heads that are full of stuff. But actually it doesn't make any difference necessarily to the way we live or to anybody else's life. And some of us, we get really into sharing our resources and serving and eating together. And the danger there is that we become like a huge pair of hands. We're out of balance. Bodies with huge hands, small heads. Or some of us just get so into worship and prayer that we're like enormous beating hearts. And although all of those things, heads, hands and hearts, all of those things are really important, we'd look really strange and we wouldn't really be balanced Christians if one or more of them was too big compared to the rest of us. We need to practice all 10 of these holy habits. And that's the thing. These sorts of habits are much more likely to succeed in a community of believers than if we practice them alone. I know some people find it really hard to be part of a church. Sometimes it's because we've had bad experiences in the past. But church, as Jesus designed it, is a community of people centered around him, being changed to be like him. And because we're all wanting the same thing, surely as church we can encourage one another, we can help one another, we can see if somebody is getting out of kilter, out of balance, and gently but lovingly bring them back onto a more balanced Christian life. Sometimes when we get things wrong, we think we've blown it. We can be encouraged, we can be loved, we can be brought back into community, and people can say, have another go, try again. So these sorts of habits are much more likely to succeed in community than alone. And I think one of the other things I've discovered is that sometimes these things go in seasons. It's important that we keep them in balance, but life has natural rhythms and rules, and sometimes we need perhaps to concentrate more on some than others. It's when the church does that, or as individuals do that for a long period of time, that things get out of kilter. But we should have daily habits and weekly habits and monthly habits and maybe yearly habits as we try to develop these holy habits together. And having said that these things are more likely to succeed in community than alone, I want to suggest this. Really important that we realise exactly what church is. One of the great things about the pandemic that we're suffering at the moment is that we've been forced out of our buildings. And as I listen to some of the things that are going on at the moment about reopening church buildings and stuff like that, it's made me realise how very dependent on those buildings and the things that we do, the services and the organisations and the programme. We become so dependent on those things. One writer said that we've got it so together that if you took the Holy Spirit out of our churches, probably about 95% of stuff would go on just as before, without us even realising the difference that's occurred. So church, it's more than just a Sunday thing. It's part of our Sunday through Saturday way of life. A meet up with John in the Y. We talk about how our individual spiritual lives are going. We talk about our visions and our plans for the church. The church is gathering. John phones up somebody, makes a pastoral call, a pastoral visit. Church is going on. We get together in a small group. Church is going on. Some of us meet to go out for a walk together. Church is going on. Church is more than just a Sunday thing. It's part of our Sunday through Saturday way of life. How are we as a church reflecting that? Think about it. Yes, hopefully, we all have ways that we practice the 10 habits alone. But maybe we're not so good at practicing them together anymore. I think churches do go through seasons, and for various reasons, things go out of fashion or things become less easy because of our jobs and our families and stuff. But let's ask the question now, how are we as a church reflecting the fact that church is more than just a Sunday thing? We need to look for opportunities to share our lives with one another, yes, but also we need to meet up with one another's friends who aren't Christians yet. There are some official ways that we can meet up too. We can be part of a prayer meeting. We can be part of a home group. And if you say, well, I really can't get out to the prayer meeting on a Tuesday night that the church organises. Well, to be honest, I don't often go. One of the wonderful things, once again, that COVID-19 has done, it's meant that although we're alone as well as together, we can spend a particular time during the week all praying together for our needs, the needs of our friends, the needs of our communities. We're not together, but we're still doing it, as it were, together. Home groups, all those things. Things that we can get involved in. And if you say, well, yeah, I'd love to get involved, when things go back to normal again, whatever that's going to look like, I'd love to go to the prayer meeting on a Tuesday night, but actually, I really don't like going out in the evenings. Well, I got a suggestion. Don't wait for somebody to organise something for you. Why not come to the leadership and say, hey, I'd like to do this. I'd like to gather a group together in my home for lunch one day a week, and we can pray together. Because I tell you what, I don't think any of the leadership team would be against that. I think, in fact, we would probably celebrate the fact that people are beginning to take responsibility for themselves and their own lives. I got really into trouble at one of the churches where I was pastor, because I went on a bit of a campaign to stop people being spoon-fed. But let's face it, from time to time, that's what happens. We all actually expect people to lay things on for us, rather than getting on and doing it ourselves. contributing, playing our own part. If people used to come to me and say, Dave, I've got this vision for something that the church could do, often I would say, listen, that's your vision. God's given you that. As a church, we'll support you. We love you. You're part of us. But God's given you this vision. If we can resource you, if we can pray for you, we will. But why don't you get on and do what God has given you to do? Anyway, I've got off topic a bit now. Of course, there are other ways that we can exhibit the fact that church is more than just a Sunday thing. We can have meals together. We can meet up for coffee. We can pray together. Well, at least we will be able to, hopefully, again, when things are released. And if we can't, if it's going to be a long time, we need to be creative. How can we have that sense of being together through the week when we can't physically see one another? I've got friends who from time to time phone me up on Skype or FaceTime if you're an iPhone person, and they say, hey Dave, I just made myself a brew, why don't you go and get yourself a coffee and we'll sit with that coffee and we'll just have a chat for a bit. And I love that. And at the moment I've got plenty of time, so I can do it too. I'm sure you all love getting together with your biological family members using social media when you can. Hey, why don't we do it as a church? One of the things I don't like about the way we're doing services at the moment is the fact that you see John's face, Helen's face, my face. Ugh, poor thing. And in my case, I put a PowerPoint up so you don't have to look at my face as you listen to my voice. But wouldn't it be great if we could find a way when after the service, we maybe use something like Zoom or WebEx or Skype, and we just open up an online meeting room, and those of you who can are able to join, and we can chat and we can drink a cup of coffee together and we can ask questions and stuff like that. But let's remember, not everybody has got these modern ways of communicating. Not everyone has a computer. Not everyone has smartphones in our church. Let's be creative too and think about ways that we can share our common life together around Jesus with people who don't have computers. Telephones, letters, send them a drawing through the post if you're arty and you want to encourage them. There's got to be ways that we can do these things. And of course now, particularly in England, you can meet up in the open air. Not that I would want to do that on the day that I'm recording this, because it's pretty dreek outside. But on a nice day, why not sit at opposite ends of a bench with a flask of tea between you and catch up? Why not, as I've seen a lot of my neighbours doing, put a table out in your garden and some chairs and get your neighbours and you can sit socially distance and get on with it. Anyway, once again, I've very much got off topic, and I can see the timer on my computer ticking on. Anyway, I want to encourage you to run with these holy habits to grow more and more and more like Jesus. Actually, they're really simple things to do. And Jesus knew that they would be habits that we could manage, and they'd encourage us, they'd grow us up, and they'd also grow the church as well. So God bless, and go on practicing the holy habits.